Imagine walking through a city that shouldn't exist. You are standing in the middle of America, but you are not looking at log cabins, brick factories, or the smoke-filled skyline of the Industrial Revolution. Instead, you are surrounded by massive, gleaming white palaces that rival the grandeur of ancient Rome. There are domes larger than the U.S. Capitol. There are canals reminiscent of Venice, lined with electric lights that turn night into day. Technology that at the time was supposedly in its infancy. This wasn't a dream. This was Chicago in 1893. They called it the White City. Historians tell us this was the world's Columbian Exposition. They tell us that this entire metropolis, spanning nearly 700 acres and featuring over 200 massive neoclassical buildings, was built from scratch in a swamp in less than 2 years. They tell us it was built with men with horses, wagons, and primitive hand tools, fighting against one of the harshest winters in history. And then they tell us the most unbelievable part of all. As soon as the fair ended, they burned it all to the ground. Does that story actually make sense to you? For generations, we have accepted this narrative without question. We look at the sepia-toned photographs of these colossal structures, the intricate statues, the advanced engineering, and we nod our heads. But today, a growing number of people are asking a dangerous question. What if the history books are wrong? What if the White City wasn't built in 1893? What if it was found? Welcome to the mystery of the impossible city. Today, we are going to dig beneath the official story of the Chicago World's Fair. We are going to look at the anomalies in the construction photos, the impossibility of the timeline, and the convenient fire that destroyed the evidence. We are going to explore the theory that this wasn't a celebration of the future, but a final farewell to a lost civilization that was already here long before we arrived. To understand why this theory is gaining so much traction, we have to start with the math, because the math simply doesn't add up. The official story states that construction on the World's Fair began in 1891 and opened to the public in May 1893. That gives the builders roughly 24 months. In that time, they allegedly transformed a desolate, waterlogged swamp on the edge of Lake Michigan into the most sophisticated architectural complex the world had ever seen. To grasp the sheer scale of this, you have to look at the buildings themselves. The Manufacturers and Liberal Arts Building was massive. It was so large that you could fit the Great Pyramid of Giza inside it with room to spare. Its roof rose 200 feet into the air, covering 44 acres of floor space without a single central support column. And we are expected to believe this engineering marvel was designed, materials sourced, foundations laid, and fully constructed in a matter of months. Remember, this is 1890s Chicago. There were no power tools, no cranes as we know them today, no computer-aided design. Logistics were handled by telegraph and paper ledgers. The roads were mud. And yet the level of precision in these buildings puts modern construction to shame. Critics of the official narrative point out a glaring inconsistency when looking at the construction photos. If you search the archives, you will find thousands of photos of the finished buildings, glorious, perfect, and teeming with crowds. But try to find a photo of the foundations being poured. Try to find a photo of the Manufacturers Building half-finished. They're surprisingly rare. The few construction photos that do exist often show scaffolding around buildings that look suspiciously complete, as if they are being repaired or restored rather than built from the ground up. The speed of construction is the smoking gun. Even today, with modern technology, billions of dollars, and unlimited resources, a project of this scale would take a decade.
Are we really supposed to believe that men with shovels and pulleys built a city of marble palaces in 2 winters? Or is it more likely that they were simply excavating and renovating a sprawling complex that had been abandoned for centuries? Now, the skeptics among you will say, but wait, these weren't real buildings. They were made of plaster and hemp. This is the standard historical explanation. We are told that the White City was a stage set, a temporary illusion made of a material called staff, a mixture of plaster, cement, and jute fibers slapped onto wooden frames to look like stone. This explanation is convenient because it explains why the buildings had to be destroyed, right? They were temporary. They wouldn't last through a Chicago winter. But look closer at the photographs. Look at the sheer load-bearing requirements of these structures. The buildings held thousands of people, heavy industrial machinery, massive steam engines, and entire train locomotives on their second floors. Could a temporary wooden frame covered in plaster really support the weight of the world's heaviest artillery and machinery displays? Furthermore, consider the statues. The Statue of the Republic, a 65-foot-tall golden giant standing in the Grand Basin, was a masterpiece of art. The intricate cornices, the towering columns, the delicate fretwork on the arches, the level of detail is mind-boggling. To sculpt all of this from plaster in such a short time would require an army of Michelangelos working around the clock. And then there's the durability issue. Chicago is known as the Windy City for a reason. Its winters are brutal, with freezing gales coming off the lake. Yet these temporary plaster buildings withstood fierce storms and rain without dissolving. Photos from the fair show crisp, sharp edges on the masonry. If it were cheap plaster, one season of rain would have turned the White City into a melting slurry of gray mud. But it didn't. It stood proud and perfect, looking indistinguishable from solid marble and granite. Was the staff narrative created to explain why such magnificent stone structures were demolished? If you tell the public it's just fake plaster, it's unsafe, nobody objects when you blow it up with dynamite. But if they knew they were destroying heritage stone temples, there would have been a revolution.
The architecture, however, is just the shell of the mystery. The real anomaly is the power pulsating through the veins of the White City. 1893 was the year electricity officially announced itself to the world. And it didn't just flicker, it blinded. The fair was illuminated by hundreds of thousands of light bulbs. At night, the White City glowed with a brilliance that had never been seen on Earth before. Searchlights swept the sky, and colored beams danced on the fountains. This was the battleground of the current wars between Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla. Tesla won the contract to power the fair using his alternating current system, AC. But looking at the complexity of the electrical grid in the fair, one has to wonder, was this really the first time this technology was used at this scale? Or was this a demonstration of a rediscovered power source? There were moving walkways, essentially massive conveyor belts that transported thousands of people along the pier. There were electric boats gliding silently through the canals. There were fax machines. The level of sophistication feels completely out of step with the horse and buggy world just outside the fairground gates. Conspiracy theorists suggest that the White City was actually a functional power plant. The layout of the buildings, the water in the canals, the obelisks and the domes, it all resembles a giant circuit board. Was the architecture itself a machine? Were the domes harvesting atmospheric energy the same way Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower was designed to do years later? It's interesting to note that after the fair, the technology seemed to regress. We went back to burning coal and oil. The free, wireless, abundant energy that seemed to be hinted at in Chicago didn't proliferate, it vanished. The fair teased a utopia of clean energy, and then, quite literally, the lights went out.
The end of the White City is perhaps the most suspicious chapter of this entire saga. The fair was set to close in October 1893. There was talk of preserving some of the buildings. After all, they were beautiful. But then tragedy struck. The mayor of Chicago was assassinated. A gloom fell over the city. And then the fires started. First, a fire in the cold storage building killed nearly 20 firefighters. Then, in January and July of 1894, massive fires swept through the fairgrounds, reducing the temporary palaces to ash and twisted metal. The official story is that it was arson or accidents involving squatters, but the destruction was so total, so systematic, that it feels like a controlled demolition. Why destroy it? If these buildings were truly plaster, they would have fallen apart in a few years. Why the rush to burn them? Why the need to dynamite the remaining walls? The destruction of the White City served a specific purpose. It removed the evidence. Once the buildings were rubble, no one could drill into the columns to see if they were solid stone. No one could study the foundations to see if they were hundreds of years old. The fire turned the anomaly back into a myth. And what replaced it? The grim, gray architecture of the 20th century. We traded the neoclassical brilliance of the White City for concrete blocks and steel cages. It was as if humanity was shown a glimpse of a higher civilization, a golden age, and then immediately forced to forget it. This brings us to the theory that ties it all together, the idea of a lost global civilization, often referred to by internet researchers as Tartaria. The theory proposes that in the not-so-distant past, a highly advanced civilization spanned the globe. They built star forts, cathedrals, and massive capitol buildings that utilized frequency and vibration for energy. They were a peaceful, unified culture. But something happened, a mud flood, a cataclysm, or a war that wiped them out or drove them away. The inheritors, the current ruling powers of the 19th century, found these empty cities. In America, they found them in Chicago, San Francisco, Nashville, and St. Louis. They couldn't explain how they were built, so they repurposed them. They cleaned off the mud, slapped a coat of fresh paint on them, and called them World's Fairs. They opened them to the public for a few months to inaugurate the new history, to claim ownership over the architecture. And then, because they didn't know how to maintain the technology, or because they wanted to hide the truth of the past, they destroyed them. Think about it. Chicago, St. Louis, San Francisco, Buffalo, all had massive World's Fairs with Greco-Roman architecture that were allegedly built in months and then destroyed. Is it a coincidence, or was it a systematic program of erasing the old world to build the new world? When you look at the solitary surviving building from the Chicago Fair, the Museum of Science and Industry, formerly the Palace of Fine Arts, you see a structure of solid limestone and brick. It wasn't plaster. It was real. And it is still standing today, 130 years later. If one was real, why assume the others were fake? Because the history books say so? The 1893 Chicago World's Fair remains one of the most baffling events in American history. We are asked to believe that a society that still relied on horses for transport pulled off the greatest construction miracle of all time, only to throw it in the trash like a disposable wrapper. They called it the White City because of its pristine color, but perhaps the name has a deeper meaning. It was a blank slate, a bright light meant to blind us to what was really there. Was Chicago built in 1893, or was it dug up? Was it a fairground, or was it a functioning power station from a forgotten age? We may never know the full truth. The ashes of the White City have long since been buried under the soil of Jackson Park. But the photos remain, the unease remains, and the question still haunts us. Did we really build that? Or did we just inherit the keys to a kingdom we didn't understand, and in our ignorance, burn it down? Look at the images again. Look at the faces of the people in the crowds. They look small, out of place, like children wandering through the ruins of giants. Maybe that's exactly what we are.